Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's very exciting to see the room. I'm Federica Genovese, a fellow here at St. Antony's, a member of the European Study Center. And today we are delighted to have Dr. Beiser-McGrath from the Social Policy Department at LSE giving a talk for us tonight. Liam has been working on environmental and climate policy issues for several years. He is a co-editor of the Environmental Politics Journal. He has been working in this area, specifically looking at public opinion for a while. And today he's presenting a paper that does exactly that. So you have about 30 minutes. We do have a discussant in the sort of like European Study Center, sort of like tradition. Is Matt Harensoff, who is over here, a postdoc in the Department of Politics and International Relations. So the 30 minutes, then Matt is going to have about 10 minutes for comments, and then we'll do it tonight.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for turning up, and it's really nice to see you this evening. So as Federica mentioned, I've been working a lot on issues surrounding environment, climate change, public opinion, public acceptance of policy over the past few years. And this talk today is actually moving a little bit more towards the area of energy. And partly this is because a lot of the action in terms of decarbonization is in the energy sector, right? So big kind of changes and kind of big policy initiatives in this area have kind of long and quite powerful downstream effects when we're thinking about the reality of mitigating climate change in the world. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is the idea of transfers and kind of government intervention in ways to potentially cushion the blow of the transition for many people. And a lot of the kind of way that this is typically thought of as a kind of predominant case in the energy sector is with regards to the coal transition and the phasing out of fossil fuels, right? So this is a big area for many countries in terms of decarbonizing the energy sector and transitioning in a way that will allow for a kind of more climate neutral, net zero economy and energy grid, but keeping in mind that people are going to be affected by this from an economic perspective. Now, the coal sector is one area where this is the case, but this feeds into broadly many areas that we care about in terms of energy, climate change, and the environment. And this work on transfers is really an emerging kind of area in the public sector, right? So I've done some work on this before in terms of coupling carbon taxation with transfers to kind of offset some of these negative effects that might be felt by people in the pocketbook. Federica, of course, has been doing a lot of work on this more broadly in terms of climate policy and transitions and the sense of building coalitions. And a key aspect here is thinking about the extent to which these are kind of broad-based programs or broad-based transfers versus more narrowly targeted transfers aimed at specific sectors of communities. And so a lot of the kind of way I've been thinking about this in a kind of general perspective, more broadly than just climate policy, is that from a social policy perspective or a government kind of policy perspective, universal policies, which are typically the way that a lot of things were done in many areas, not just in kind of climate and energy, but also in terms of health, education, are increasingly coming under strain for states. Right, so demographic and fiscal sustainability issues that have been all this discussion in the UK over the past months about the black hole, the budget, are increasingly kind of affecting policymakers, but also the public's kind of sense of how programs of finance and who receives the benefits from this finance. And what we're seeing from a kind of climate policy perspective, but also potentially in some of these other areas, is a move from these kind of initial interventions that were very broad-based and kind of universal, right? If you think about subsidies for renewable energy, subsidies for consumer investments in energy efficiency of improvements in the homes, the kind of 2010-ish kind of policy area was very broad-based policies that everyone could take on. But these have increasingly been narrowed over time to become more targeted on certain things, right? So in the UK, energy efficiency measures are now explicitly targeted based off of lower income groups. And so I always have this problem that my slides take a long time to load. So yeah.
So any chance we can dim the lighting for the screen?
So
Yeah.
the thing I'm very much interested in is as you shift away from universal provision, where everyone can get some kind of benefit from this, towards more targeted allocations that tend to focus on those groups that don't actually have that many economic resources in the first place, is there the potential for backlash amongst those who are seeing the kind of policy benefits withdrawn, right? So high income groups and individuals are those who are contributing a lot in terms of the actual financing through taxation. As you start to taper off these things and make them more targeted, do they kind of keep on board with this kind of policy initiative? Or do they kind of materialistically backlash and decide, well, if we're not getting something out of this, then other people should. And so partly the motivation of this comes from my work on carbon taxation, where in the UK and US context, when thinking about providing people information about the burdens of carbon taxation and how the revenues generated from carbon taxation can be targeted or redistributed with people, what you started to see there was this emerging kind of backlash amongst high income individuals, particularly in the US, where effectively, even if you add in kind of revenue recycling mechanisms, what tends to happen is you kind of make people in the poorer parts of society less opposed to carbon taxation, but potentially at the risk of starting to generate some backlash from those on the higher echelons of society, which are getting less help. So effectively, this feeds into a broader kind of interest of this universal versus targeted dimension of transfers and policy interventions. And from a kind of economic perspective, there's kind of very clear guidelines and clear ideas about the trade-offs involved in this, right? So universal programs are pretty simple to administer, but they run into issues of economic efficiency where people who would have maybe engaged in behavior otherwise are being paid to do things that they would have done. Of course, you can target more, which makes it more cost effective, more efficient, but this is harder to administer. And there's a broad social policy literature about issues regarding stigmatization of those who are from vulnerable communities or poor communities being less likely to actually take on these targeted programs than if it was part of a universal approach. However, broadly understood, the political logic has been less developed in this area. So there's a broad literature in social policy in the 90s that talks about this, where the basic insights is that universality is actually quite necessary for sport and success. So if you know the paradox of redistribution arguments, that actually universal systems do better at reducing inequality for many of these reasons, because they have this broad-based buy-in, and those who can benefit are less likely to kind of avoid these issues regarding targeting. And so what I want to do is kind of get a sense of how this works out when thinking about the energy sector and transitions moving forward. And so the basic idea, kind of theoretically from this paper, is to really focus this from a kind of material perspective and thinking about how individuals, given their position economically, engage with these different types of transfers, either from the kind of pocketbook impact, so how they materially are affected or not, the redistributive or the distributional inequality-based impact in terms of seeing how poorer or richer individuals benefit from a proposed policy, and then also the interaction of these two things, right? So building a bit on this altruistic rich argument that high income individuals, even if they're losing out materially from a more targeted program, may prefer it for inequality reducing reasons. And so the way I'm going to do this is by looking at the case of the UK's energy price guarantee. It was implemented a couple of years ago, where this is a case where you started off with a very broad-based universal intervention that then explicitly got targeted over time. And so usually I talk about stuff with climate policy, about making people pay for polluting. This is actually kind of like the opposite, right? So this is a policy that actually incentivizes people to consume their energy much in the same way as they did before, because it lowered the price of energy consumption in this time of higher global market prices. Okay, but this is an interesting case to look at because a lot of the design features map on quite well with other areas where we have these kind of universal versus target approaches. And we can hold the case constant because we have this explicit transition within the policy where it starts off universal and then you can see the tapering off. So we can explore the extent to which individuals, say in the higher parts of the income distribution, once their benefit gets rolled back, do they continue to support the benefits for the poorer members of society? And the way I'm going to do this is using survey experiments to try and isolate the causal effect of information about the material payoffs from this policy, whether that's for you personally or for different groups within society, and how that affects people's policy preferences. So to give you the findings already before we go into more detail, so absent any kind of comparison between universal versus targeted policy measures, what you find is that these kind of pocketbook material benefits lead to increased support all across the income distribution, regardless of you're rich or poor, right? So absent a comparison of universal and targeted, people like the money that they get from it. However, once you introduce this comparison about how the payoff structure changes, moving from a universal to a targeted approach, then you start to see this income gradient that was similar to what I showed with carbon taxation, where you get a backlash amongst richer individuals who prefer a universal approach rather than a targeted. Now, interestingly, what happens here, though, is that if you contextualize this information with the distributional impacts, so yes, you as a richer person may be losing money, but this is actually leading to a policy that's benefiting poorer individuals more. This starts to mitigate the backlash. And although there remains an income gradient, what we'll see is that actually it's not sufficient to actually lead to opposition. And so more broadly, what this is suggesting is that in the move from making policy more cost effective, more targeted, if it is contextualized with its kind of inequality reducing and distributional benefits, then this can stymie much of the backlash that we could potentially see otherwise. Right? And so this is going to contrast a bit from the taxation and the cost-based side, that at least when it comes to the provision of benefits, richer individuals don't backlash as long as it's contextualized with this inequality reducing distributional benefit. So I want to go briefly into the kind of theoretical approach to give you a sense of like how the existing literature and kind of theoretical approaches would think about each of these different pieces of information and how they would affect preferences. And then after that, I'm going to go through the research design and ultimately results. So a lot of the theoretical approach here is really kind of influenced from a kind of micro motivation political economy perspective. You can link this kind of earlier to kind of classics in terms of taxation, such as Meltzer Richards, but in terms of my specific work on carbon taxation, a lot of the focus here is this distinction between these kind of pocketbook egotropic concerns that individuals have. Right? So how am I personally affected versus the broader distributional inequality aversion concerns that people may have in terms of policy. And so we're going to apply this to the case of universal and targeted programs. And to conceptualize why we might expect to see different results, it may be the case that when we're thinking about benefits, we're having a different logic than costs, as is in the case of taxation. From a micro perspective, this may be from a kind of prospect theory, loss aversion type argument, that people are more sensitive to costs rather than benefits. So we may expect a different kind of pattern to emerge when we're looking at transfers rather than the explicit funding policies. So in terms of the basics of the pocketbook approach, the basic logic here is that individuals support policies which are personally expected. Right? So this kind of dates back to kind of classic models of economic voting, but the basic idea being that universal programs provide benefits to all citizens, whereas targeted programs concentrate benefits, in this case, amongst lower income groups. Right? So if this is the logic by which people are making their assessments, then you would expect that there is heterogeneity in support for universal versus targeted programs, depending on where you are in the income distribution and ultimately the extent to which you can benefit from these programs. Right, so the high income should prefer a more universal approach because they get some buy-in and some payout off of this, whereas lower income individuals will have a weak preference for targeted approaches compared to universal. Second side of this then is obviously the kind of distributional side. So if people are more concerned about distributional impacts, inequality aversion, then this kind of literature would dictate that across the board, people should just prefer the targeted versus the universal approach, right? So if this is the logic by which people are making their decisions, then we shouldn't see any kind of income gradient support because people are primarily following their issues in terms of inequality aversion rather than their own material decision. And then finally, we can have this mixed motives kind of altruistic rich logic where we have the combination of the two, such that these individual and distributional concerns can interact with one another. And in this case, the richer individuals may be willing to receive less of a benefit from the program if it can be shown to be inequality reduced, right? So inequality reducing aspects of programs can weaken the negative impact that losing money for richer individuals from targeted programs experience. And so in this case, what we would be looking for is a weaker income gradient to support the universal over targeted policy as this gets weaker. So that's the kind of basics in terms of what we're going to be looking for to try and get a sense of how people's preferences are formed and what kind of motivations they're following in this area. So how do we go about actually trying to test this from a research sense? So we're going to utilize information from Treasury estimates about this UK transfer scheme in terms of payoffs that people would receive based off their income. This is a survey experiment that was conducted a year ago in the UK, so right around the time that it switched to a more targeted policy, and this is broadly representative. So in terms of the specifics of what the policy looks like, so the initial response is a universal price cap on all energy bills. Right, so effectively the unit price cap was designed so that the average household's bill would be approximately £2,500 each. And then after this initial phase of 6 months for the policy, then it switched to a more targeted transfer. So you have still some universal component that's less generous. So the cap increased to approximately average household bill of £3,000 a year. But you have more explicit cost of living payments that are explicitly targeted to those on the lower end of the income distribution. Right, so this is not moving to a purely targeted policy, but it's making it more targeted as opposed to. So as noted, I'm interested in how information touching on these different aspects of motivations affects people's decision making. And so effectively, we're going to have people in 4 different treatment conditions. So in the control condition, you receive no information in terms of like explicitly how you benefit or how other people benefit from this. It's just asking people what they think about the policy and when they support. The first treatment arm is going to get specific individual impact information. So based off of their income, what was their projected gains from the different policy designs, but without any reference to any other income groups or the overall impact. The second treatment arm is not going to be told how they would personally benefit or have personally benefited, but just simply what were the impacts for the top 10% and the bottom 10% of the population. And then the third treatment arm combines these together such that you know how you would personally benefit, plus this is contextualized with the information of how other people were affected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the overall kind of design outline in terms of how the experiment proceeds to give you a sense of where the variation is coming from. And then with the results, what I'm going to do is just introduce each part as it comes with the actual results so that it's kind of got a clear connection so you see patterns. So the baseline before there's any information is basically one, getting information on people's incomes, because this forms the projection of what benefits they potentially get from the policy or not. And then second, I wanted to elicit some baseline beliefs about how you felt, whether you benefited from the policy or not, and what you thought the distribution of benefits from the policy was at home. So then people enter the first treatment condition, and this will then depend on whether they're getting the kind of individual versus distributional versus combined information. And this first information is just simply about what the current state of the EPG looked like at that point in time, which was the more targeted version, right? So how are you personally benefiting from this current version? What is the distributive benefits from this current version? From there, we probe, okay, to what extent people then support this policy. And we have a repeated measurement again of the personal and the distributional benefits to see whether this information changes how people assess both the distributional and the personal impacts of the policy. Then after that, it brings in the comparison of the policy as it stood, the more targeted version, to the initially universal version. So that is allowing to see for individuals to give them the information. Okay, this is what you're currently receiving, but if you were still under the original plan, this is what you would have received, or what the other groups would have received, or this combination of the two. And then I'm going to measure kind of a relative preference, so whether you choose the universal versus the targeted policy, and then also an absolute preference in terms of general support for both versions of these to get a sense of what's going on, if there's a kind of prioritization effect versus a backlash. Okay. So as said, with the results, I'm going to walk through the specific information for each of these before showing you the results so it's kind of fresh in your mind. But to first give you a sense of what the policy kind of environment looked like with the more targeted version. So this graph shows the kind of expected payoff by income decile of the more targeted version of the policy. And as you would expect with kind of progressive targeted policies, you get a larger payoff if you're poorer, and then this shrinks down the richer you are. Right? And so as noted, individuals are going to get information about either the individual benefit they got, the distribution, so either the top 10%, bottom 10%, or the combination of these two. So explicitly what this looks like, so first everyone gets a kind of introduction to the policy to kind of make them aware that this is what we're talking about. So also in the control, that just simply states that this is the policy that exists and what the price guarantee is. If you're in the individual treatment group, then you're getting this additional information where effectively based off your income decile, it types in what was the value that you're going to get, right, based on this previous graph. The group that just receives distributional information receives nothing about how you would personally benefit. It's just simply told that the poorest individuals are receiving this benefit, the richest individuals are receiving this benefit. And then the third group has this information combined and contextualized together, right? So you are saving this amount of money, and in context, the top 10% of households are saving this amount, the bottom 10% of households are saving this. And so what does that look like then in terms of policy support? So effectively, the y-axis is the treatment effect. So comparing those who have received some information to those in the control group who receive no additional information, and looking at how that treatment affects across the income deciles. There's two ways that this is done, either just in a linear interaction effect, right? So imposing a linear relationship between income and the treatment effect, or breaking this up into terciles to potentially allow for some non-linearity in these effects. And so without any contextualization and just learning about what's going on in the policy in the first place, what you see is that those treatments where there's some indication of how much you're personally benefiting, they lead to significant increases in support, so T1 and T3. Whereas just simply learning that richer people benefited less than poorer individuals, doesn't change people's support for this.
Sorry to interrupt, but I wondered about it, just a really technical thing. My understanding is that the wholesale prices in 2002 correspond very, very high.
Yeah.
But by spring of 2023, wholesale prices at least had come way, way down.
Yeah.
And so, can you help me understand, like, to what extent does that matter for what retail consumers in the UK are actually experiencing?
So the actual
Are they
policy
actually
itself.
saving money, or is the price cap binding in real terms, or is it sort of a nominal thing that doesn't actually affect what they pay?
So in this time period, it was binding. This year, it was not, wouldn't have been binding, but the policy is phased out. So this is still a time period where it was binding. Right. And so this is why, so these estimates in terms of the actual benefits are based off of the market prices at that time. And so, at least in the initial instance of just purely a targeted policy, this doesn't really shift support. Where we see kind of clear income gradients is that those who are receiving this information are significantly updating their belief that they personally benefited from the policy. So this is the case particularly for poorer individuals and less so for richer individuals. And just to kind of check that the manipulation is working, the main update in terms of this distributional impact of the policy, so whether richer individuals are benefiting more or less relative to poorer individuals, primarily happens with those who are receiving the distributional information. Right, so the null result in terms of policy support isn't driven by people just not realizing it's helping poor people, right? You see a clear updating here in terms of significantly thinking it helps poor people more than richer individuals than before, but it just doesn't translate at this stage into actual changes in support for the policy itself. So after that kind of baseline of what was the policy environment at the time where it's more targeted, what we then do is then bring in this comparison to how the policy looked like originally when it was universal and didn't have that explicit targeting mechanism. Right? And so this orange line is what the payoff structure looks like from the more universal version of the policy. Right? So as you would expect broadly with a universal policy, you have a pretty much flat line here. There's a slight uptick when it comes to the very highest individuals because they have much larger houses, consume more energy. But broadly, this is kind of matching what you'd expect from the universal. Right, and so now what's going on is that we're going to introduce this explicit comparison between how the payoff structures have changed comparing the two policies. Right, so effectively what that does is that we kind of reintroduce that what happened in terms of your payoff from the versions of the policy, but then explicitly telling someone under the old version of the policy, you've got this, under the current version, you get this. Right, so what that means is that if you're a high income individual, you learn that, well, when it was universal, you were getting much more money, right? Whereas as a poor individual, you actually learn that the targeted version is giving you a bit more money. If you have the distributional information, again, then what you get is this explicit comparison where broadly the poorest and the richest get very similar amounts under the old version, but then this changes with the new version where the poorest get about double of this amount. And then finally, the combined information shows you again how much you are getting from the new version of the policy compared to how people are getting, how much you're getting for the older version of the policy. And again, this comparison with the poorest 10% and the richest 10%. And again, making this very explicit that under the old version, you would get this payoff, right? So if you're richer, this would be higher. And so in this case, what you would see is this change here. And so you're seeing both the change in your own personal finances, plus the change for the richest and the poorest. So what does that do in terms of the relative comparison or the Foyle's choice comparison? So this is where you see the very clear kind of income gradients emerging. So this dotted line here is what you would call the line of indifference. So where people are indifferent between universal and targeted. If you have a value above the line or a treatment effect above the line, that's the cases where you prefer a targeted approach rather than a universal approach. If you look below the line, this is areas where you prefer the universal rather than the targeted. And so if people are just purely learning about how this affects them in terms of their pocketbook, then you see this very strong income gradient in terms of poorer individuals preferring targeting, richer individuals preferring more universal policy. There's actually a very interesting dynamic, which sadly is underpowered to explore more, and echoes a little bit some of the carbon type stuff I've done before, but a lot of the action happens in this kind of 70th to 80th percentile, right? So if you're in the 70th to 80th percentile, you actually tend to be more opposed to more opposed to targeted policy than universal policy than those who are the very rich, right? So the very rich, these kind of differences in a couple of £100 aren't really making much of an impact in terms of their policy. Rather, it's really this kind of 60th to 80th percentile that's going on. You see this if you break this into deciles, but this is underpowered for doing this because we only have about 500 people in each group. But this is an interesting dynamic. If people only learn the distributional impact, then everyone just likes targeted, right? So they don't condition on their income. But then when you combine the two, what you see is that while the income gradient weakens, it's still a significant income gradient. So the richer you are, the less you like targeted policy, the more you prefer a universal approach. But the distributional information lifts up the level here, or the intercept, such that you never get to the point where you actively prefer universal to targeted. Like there's not a building of opposition there in the same way as that you have here, right? So this is basically saying that when given the choice between the two, richer individuals do prefer kind of being less targeted than universal, but it's not enough to generate a significant backlash when it's contextualized with this inequality. And so a lot of the action, as we'll see, is going on in terms of the absolute levels of support for these different policies when we kind of compare them in isolation. So this is the absolute level of support for universal policy, again, given these treatment conditions. And what you see is that the reason we get this gradient emerging is that richer individuals increase their support significantly for universal policy when they realize the payoff structure they get from this. But distributional information brings this back down again, right? So learning that richer individuals get kind of the same as poorer individuals weakens public support. And so this leads to a balance such that universal policy is opposed by the poorest when they get both of these pieces of information, and leads to indifference amongst the richest when they learn that, okay, you will get less, but poorer individuals will get. And so if we look at the change in support for targeted policy from just after that first treatment to just after the second treatment, what you find there is that really poorer individuals significantly increase their support for targeted policy when they realize that this is benefiting them more than a universal approach. Actually, this is this graph. So this is the one which is the change in terms of how people's levels of support changes. And what you find is that it doesn't really change richer individuals' support, so they don't become more supportive of targeted policy when they contextualize it with universal policy. But it does significantly increase the support amongst lower income individuals when they realize that a targeted approach is a better deal for them than a universal approach to investing in this. So one area that I need to look into a bit more, and this is again looking at heterogeneous effects from other dimensions. So kind of quick cut is like, how does this vary by people's party identification within the UK? And what you're seeing is that in the case of the UK, conservative kind of centre-right, right-wing voters, they're far more responsive to the material pocketbook dynamic of this than Labour voters, right? So social democrats tend to be more attuned to the distributional impact, such that when you provide this information, you get almost a flat income gradient amongst the centre-left voters compared to the centre-right. So, in summary, so transfers of this sort, and more broadly, are kind of increasingly relevant, not just for crisis responses, but also facilitating transitions where, as part of your transition, you're trying to raise the costs to change behavior, but you might want to compensate people to avoid some of the inequities that come about from this. And while we know a lot about the kind of economic trade-offs between going a more universal versus targeted approach, it's really an emerging area to see how this actually plays out on the political sphere and how people engage in terms of policy preferences as a result of this. Particularly because targeted policies do depend on richer individuals contributing to the pot to benefit poorer individuals. And so a lot of this is focusing in this kind of research agenda on the material foundations of the public support from this perspective. And again, just to kind of summarize what the main findings were, so these individual impacts really cause increases in support for targeted policy when they're just provided in kind of isolation. However, you get this income gradient or this polarization by income when you have this comparison between a universal versus targeted approach. However, when contextualized with distributional information, this means that actually richer individuals still then generate a preference for targeted versus universal policies. Again, buying into this altruistic rich type of argument that those on the highest part of the income distribution are willing to face some material loss of benefits if it has these broader distributional and inequality reduced goals. And so at least in this kind of case of transfers and providing the benefits, and in contrast to issues such as carbon taxation, a shift from kind of universal to targeted policy approaches is not generating a significant backlash amongst the high income. And just to kind of feed in a bit more broadly where this kind of research agenda is going in terms of how energy costs are kind of increasingly being part of the climate policy, environmental policy discussion. Another kind of paper I'm working on right now has a lot of measurements and information about how people actually experience this energy crisis in terms of difficulties with paying their bills, difficulties with the cost of living. And what you find is that those who are finding it particularly difficult, either from, say, aggregate kind of measures or specific issues such as their energy bills, cutting energy, or spending cuts, they significantly oppose kind of stringent climate policies such as carbon taxation, right? So these kind of economic discontents actually reduce support for climate policy that's costly, but it doesn't have an impact for kind of appliance bans or green subsidies, right? So again, this kind of suggests that if we're increasingly, well, we're increasingly not doing this, but if one was to move more in the carbon pricing direction again, this kind of primacy of how people experience things through their cost of living and energy bills really necessitates some transfers and compensation to get those people back on board to support stringent. And so hopefully this kind of gives some kind of new insights on the micro foundations of policy or social policy design and public acceptance when thinking about how transfer schemes can be designed to facilitate transitions in this degree of universality versus targeting. And really, again, contextualizing how these material concerns play not just in a kind of individual egotropic pocketbook sense, but also interact with broader concerns about inequality as a means to facilitate that action. And that's it. So looking forward to your comments.
So we have 10 minutes of comments by Mark.
Okay. So thank you so much for this paper. I think it's a hugely important paper with sort of a super innovative question and super exciting results. In particular, this sort of contribution to knowing what the political and sort of the economic second best is in terms of policy design, and the fact that targeting an economically efficient policy can engender political backlash. So I think the contribution to sort of general theories of political economy is really interesting. And so the experiment is super well designed and the results are really interesting. So I think my focus could be here rather on how to make sense of these empirical estimates that you're showing. So in terms of theory, but some of my theoretical comments then have sort of suggestions for the justification of the design, both in terms of internal and external validity. But you now also have a bit of the theoretical approach in the presentation. So please forgive me if I'm saying something that you already addressed. So basically, I was thinking, I'm not sure to what extent you really want to develop your own theory and strong ex-ante expectations, but it might be useful to think about whether to have a section in the paper that sort of tries to explain the results that you're seeing in a bit more in terms of theoretical insight and make sense of them or post hoc rationalize them. And so my main two theoretical comments are basically structured around the universal versus targeted nature, and then about the pocketbook versus distributional nature. And so in terms of universal versus targeted, I was thinking that these two types of policy design, universal and targeted, they differ in a number of important ways that lead to different theoretical expectations about policy support. So one difference is in the size and the distribution of beneficiaries that they produce, right? So whoever is targeted in terms of pocketbook considerations will prefer the targeted policy, but that's not necessarily congruent with being poor in more general policy terms, independent from this. In this energy policy case, it was the case that the poor will benefit from the targeted policy, but that's not necessarily the case. So in many ways, that's exactly the interesting case, as otherwise you would just examine the preferences for redistribution, right? But the theoretical novelty here in this paper, which you could highlight much more in the contribution, is to say that the nature of the transfers is somewhat orthogonal to classic redistribution, right? Because universal can be redistributive and targeted can be regressive in theory. And additionally, in a world where there's a budget constraint from the government, switching from targeted to universal reduces the size of an individual transfer because you have to keep revenues constant. So making some people, the ones who were targeted before, worse off than they are now, right? So the question is, do they have more intense preferences over the policy? And I think the absolute levels of support here that you are showing could really be used to measure also preference intensity to get at this, and to you can sort of reframe it in that way. The second difference between universal and targeted is in terms of financing. You were getting at this a little bit in terms of your previous research about the carbon taxes, but what I was thinking is a more general thinking about the nature of costs, whether they're diffuse versus concentrated. And what matters for policy support is whether I'm better off on net from the tax and transfer scheme, not just from the transfer scheme, right? And so the nature of the costs, diffuse versus concentrated, determines, again, the intensity of preferences and possibly also political mobilization in terms of collective action. So this could be sort of integrated into some of the into some kind of section that tries to explain the results in terms of. And the last difference between universal and targeted is in terms of efficiency. So you have these canonical political economy models, Acemoglu and Robinson in 2001, inefficient redistribution, right? So inefficient redistribution as a tool to sustain future political power of in their case, farmer subsidies. So these farmer subsidies are targeted transfers, and they show that they have lower efficiency due to this pork barrel politics, potentially lowering political acceptance by citizens, right? So this is the political second best. And it would be important to clarify, not just in the case study that you have, but also in terms of theory, who are the targets of targeted transfers, right? Does targeted mean means tested? If yes, this could explain support among the rich on fairness grounds. More on that on fairness grounds below. But it also points to sort of reverse causality, whereby political feasibility determines the nature of the transfers. So the general equilibrium response here is that targeted transfers are much more likely if they are more politically feasible, according to your empirical results, or they are less likely according to Ajimobi and Robertson, right? And so what do we observe empirically about the statistical distribution of targeted versus universal transfers? You could draw there on real world data about like how likely it is that we see targeted versus universal transfers in the real world. And that would get at the sort of reverse causality argument. And my second theoretical point is on the distinction between pocketbook and distribution. And so here, I wasn't 100% sure if this theoretical distinction is really disentangled by the information treatments in the following sense. First, the information about personal financial impacts. You could make an argument that this can affect both individual income pocketbook and distributional perceptions. And then you have sort of some kind of compound treatment in that way. Or by contrast, you can have distributional information that can be used to infer the pocketbook implications for my own income. I'm not sure to what extent you want to sort of make cognitive demands on, or do you want to impose assumptions about the cognitive demands that people are able to make. But what this both targeted and so the problem is that both targeted and universal benefits can be beneficial in terms of pocketbook considerations, depending on the nature of costs and benefits, but also both targeted and universal, again, targeted and universal benefits can have similar distributional consequences, again, depending on the nature of costs and benefits. And so the observable implications are less clear, don't really allow you to distinguish between the two mechanisms. 1 minute, okay, that's perfect. I only have 1 point left, which is all of this implies basically that the results on both informational treatments, a cynical person could say like, oh, that doesn't let you distinguish between the two mechanisms at all, based on what I've just said, as these pocketbook and distribution concerns could be driving the results jointly. So what is really important here, and you've highlighted that in the presentation, is the post-treatment and manipulation questions, where you are really sort of saying like, well, hang on a minute, we can worry about compound treatment effects here, but actually this is how people understand the treatment. So that's super convincing. The only problem though is that theoretically, pocketbook and distributional concerns can look very similar and can capture the same underlying concept as the distribution of benefits affects the pocketbook income. And maybe a more useful way would be to think about fairness concerns, which you're mentioning in terms of with respect to the altruistic rich literature, but replacing the distributional concerns with fairness concerns would allow you to have really different and distinguishing observable implications. And you do mention these fairness arguments in the literature on the altruistic rich, but that could go against inequality aversion and does not need to be the same as inequality aversion. So here the real distinction is between luck versus effort. That's more important here. So yeah, I have more comments, but I can send you that over email. So yeah, thank you for this paper. It's fascinating stuff. So thank you so much.
Nice. I'd say we open up. Can you turn the lights on? Like, I need to wake up again. Great. So I'd say we take a few, and then you get to connect the dots however you want, also responding to what Matt said, or you also can talk about it, of course. When you get your turn, can you please introduce yourself and say who you are and where you come from?
Great. Yeah, I'm Jeff Colgan. I'm from Brown University, but on sabbatical leave here for the full year at Oxford. And thank you, Lynn, for the great paper. I think it's really great topic and really nice kind of clear cut into the issue that one of the kind of key issues that matters most. The thing that struck me about it is that there are good reasons to do survey experiments for all the reasons that you know. But one of the sort of weaknesses, all methods have weaknesses, and one of the weaknesses of survey experiments is that the treatment is relatively modest as we think about this is not like a pharmaceutical drug where you can really give a high dose. This is a relatively low dose kind of treatment. And furthermore, it's mediated by what's going on in the world at that particular moment when you do the snapshot. And so one thing that strikes me is as a way to give this paper kind of a 1-2 punch that would really, I would find compelling, would be to think about how the treatment of price support itself in the real world, in the UK, changed over time. And in particular, it's still changed, right? So I think I read a headline this morning in this morning's paper about how, this is changing with, winter biting and snow this morning and all the rest. And so although you've done a really nice experiment using that sort of observational data over time as the policy shifts might give you another window on how kind of support for these policies, ideally by income decile, changes over time as the policy itself. And the reason that matters is because the treatment, of course, is material, right? It's actual dollars or pounds or whatever being spent. So that seems like it would be a nice way of kind of taking triangulating.
Okay, let me go down there. Yes, you.
Hi, I'm Federica. I'm an student for policy.
Please speak up.
Yeah, so I'm a student for social policy. And I have 2 questions. The first one was about, so I find it super interesting that you take the social policy approach for literature and apply them to questions. But I'm wondering, what is it about kind of energy policy? Why we would expect it to be different in social policy? Like, why would we expect the report to be different from what the characteristics, why that's different? And then my second question is kind of just more extrapolating from this. So in this case, you only gave information about distributional effects for the treatment. But we also see if the support for the transition is the support is higher, the higher income individuals for the transition. So if we were to actually extrapolate from this and have a policy that would actually support that energy transition, and as compared to distributional information, we also gave people information about the impact on the energy transition. If you would expect that to lead to even more support, just from your report.
So another question, and then whatever you want to address again. Yes, please.
Thank you, and thanks for the talk. My name's Llewellyn. I'm a faculty member at the Crawford School at the Australian National University, which is visiting here for a little while. And Jeff, I didn't know you were in town. We took a coffee.
We did.
So I was doing a little thought experiment, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about what your results might say for the related policy issue that's as important in Australia and a number of other countries, given the results that we have from this. So one of the issues that we're facing at the moment is that people who are on higher incomes are disconnecting from the gas grid and electrifying their homes, and also installing rooftop solar. And what that means is that the network costs associated with retaining those grids is increasingly falling on renters, people from lower income households. The potential policy response to that, of course, would be to subsidize rooftop solar for low income earners if they were the household rental households, for example, or also subsidize the electrification of households and the gas-related infrastructure. It seems to me that what you're saying is like something like that targeted kind of approach, as opposed to a universal subsidy for rooftop, for example, would be potentially feasible so long as you got the messaging right. On the other hand, the difference, of course, is that you're talking about the withdrawal of the benefit, whereas this would be a straight subsidy and with no withdrawal of the benefit provision of the subsidy. So I want to just kind of what you would think about that given your results. Thanks.
Do you wanna pick on anyone that you want?
I mean, I usually try and be greedy and get as many comments in this, but I think there's a few more explicit questions. I'll kind of touch on those and then we can go back to you back. And I'll kind of work in reverse order, I think. So this is something I've been thinking about broadly, and I think it's something that I was trying to avoid with this and was actually using the case design to avoid what I think is a major issue with some of these things, which is this ability to kind of select out of treatment in terms of if we think of policy, trying to increase costs or provide benefits. There's the potential for higher income individuals just to select out in a way that they're not affected, right? So a lot of my kind of work on carbon taxation, like kind of thought about this from the perspective of like higher income households like emit more in general, and you see this like in the UK, like the carbon footprint is 3x for the top 10% and the bottom 10%. But as you know, increasingly the richer individuals have ways of selecting out of this, right? It's a bit less different than carbon tax because a lot of these emissions come from flying and you can't really select out in the same way. But I think in terms of this energy issue, it's like this increasingly interesting aspect in terms of whether people are able to kind of avoid the costs or select in and out of benefits. And also, even if you have universal benefits, are they truly universal, right? So this has always been my contention with something like a feed-in tariff, which in principle, like has a universal benefit if you supply to the grid, but the ability to supply to the grid is not universally distributed amongst the population, right? And this is, I think, kind of related to your discussion about what's going on in Australia. And so in this case, it's less of an issue because it's kind of quite an instantaneous hit where the ability to source and select out in this time frame was not super plausible and feasible. But I think for broadly thinking about transfers and redistribution, I think that increasingly does become an issue because if you premise the idea of redistribution from a carbon perspective by taxing higher emitters to give to poorer people, if the higher emitters find a way to select out, then you increasingly lose the tax base that you're trying to do this redistribution with. Right, so it's a bit of more these kind of long-run dynamic concerns. I think we have less of an appreciation for from the political economy, at least in this particular way that I'm looking at it, than we really get a sense of in the literature. But I'd love to chat more about this thing. The social policy component and why it would be different. So effectively, in this sense, a lot of the traditional social policy discussion has a bit of this added level where there's like positive externalities to the universal transfer, right? If you think of stuff like education and health, such that you add these kind of other kind of dimensions kind of stacked on top of this, which I think then changes the calculation, right? So if and this goes a bit again in terms of trying to understand this from an altruistic risk perspective, where transfers kind of have knock-on effects in terms of crime and things like this from a traditional social policy perspective, where there's this extra payoff you get in terms of reducing certain externalities. That is less the case in this kind of energy issue here, I think. So I think that's the kind of main distinction where in some ways this is a simpler problem than I would say like traditional social policy kind of discussions of this are, if I was to think in this way. And how this relates to this kind of high income being more supportive. So I've always kind of taken the high income being more supportive as kind of almost ignorance in terms of how people understand the distribution of costs and benefits very often. And this was very much the case in the carbon tax kind of stuff that I was doing, that you do see like absent any kind of information, there is this strong income gradient with the richer supporting more. But as soon as like the cost implications of carbon taxation start to come, it starts to drop down like this. And so I think that's where there's a bit of a difference in this asymmetry that I kind of hinted on theoretically at the beginning, that there's how people react to costs and respond to costs I think is quite different from how people respond to a tapering of benefits kind of in this way. And so in that way, you don't see that kind of same income gradient when you have the absolute levels of support where they kind of drop off in the way that you do with the card exemption. And I think that then kind of ties in with Matt's point. And I think I've tried to do this with the presentation, but the paper, I think, I just need to be way more explicit on this, is that there are quite a few moving parts, right? And so I think what would be a good thing to do is like explicitly like indicate, okay, this comparison of this variation and this variation tells us something about this specific mechanism, right? And I think that's kind of partly what's going on with the beliefs aspect, right? Because you say, well, if I get the distributional information, I could learn where I am, and then poor individual just update more than richer, but you don't see that. So I think this is making clear what these comparisons are, to kind of make clear, okay, this is this specific mechanism. I think it's really, yeah, for the written product, can be useful for walking people through like where the action is and where the movement is, and how that relates to our kind of broader conceptions, you know.
Right, I thought.
Yeah, it's exciting work, thank you. So I've got so many things I want to ask you, but I'll try and boil down to something that's hopefully useful. There's a paradox in what you're doing, in that you're taking a policy that was super big and important, and it was part of what caused the collapse of the trust government. And you mentioned some aspects of it, but you didn't mention all aspects of it. And the fact that you actually saw these beliefs change meant that people weren't adequately aware, but the numbers involved in terms of the costs for and benefits for individuals were huge. So what does that tell you about the world when people, if you were ever going to see effects of redistribution and universalism versus targeting, and people were ever going to learn about them, they ought to have known about them already in this particular case because the effects were so big, and therefore your manipulation check almost shouldn't have had any, or your information shouldn't have had any effect because they really ought to have known about this already.
Yeah, I can lecture in the politics department here. Fascinating work. I love a lot. My comment or question is a bit related to the fairness versus distribution of treatment that we discussed and mentioned as well. So I was wondering how you selected this kind of treatment for the distribution, the phrasing of it, right? Would you expect the income gradient to disappear altogether if you also remind people about the share of family budget or household budget that is spent on energy bill and the fact that some people face energy poverty, right? Would you expect that to be a stronger distributional treatment, and sort of why didn't you go in that direction? If the underlying message of the paper is how to sell this policy better.
Tom Hale from the Botanic School and here in St. Antony's. Great paper. Two quick questions. One, I wonder if you could say a bit more about the line of questioning Matt's was beginning on the budget constraint, because it seems like the obvious implication of this work and other work in the field is that we should give more concrete benefits, long-time policy to build support, but governments are grappling between that and then really real fiscal constraints. And so if you had added a kind of information into this study on the targeted policy would cost this much, universal policy would cost this much, and is it maybe the case the targeted policy would be cheaper? Would you see a different effect? Would you expect to see a different effect? I think that's the kind of consideration that's really at the kind of core dilemma that policymakers are grappling with. And is there any other literature we can draw on to help us give us some indications around that? And secondly, on the nature of this particular case, I wonder if it might change the results because this is a response to war. This is coming out of a time when people were talking about energy war and the real national security context. And what we expect, particularly the kind of distributional considerations beyond fairness or justice considerations, to be much more of a kind of rally around the flag effects. Would that be the case for energy policy more broadly or climate policy?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Pre-treatment. Yeah. So Yeah, so what does this mean, right? So I think there's kind of two aspects that I think are interesting about this, right? So one is, should we be surprised that people are actually updating significantly, particularly on these beliefs? And I think the way it works is from the way that the benefit is construed, right? Because the benefit is about like what would be the counterfactual energy price if there was not intervention, right? So in that way, it's not super obvious the benefit for individuals just by looking at their energy bills, because what's happened is that just their energy bills aren't going up as much as they would have in the counterfactual world, right? So I think that's where the kind of impact comes in terms of updating people's beliefs. And I think this ties in with a broader kind of question, again, relating to these kind of survey experiments and how things are communicated in the real world, which is how are the benefits actually communicated, and do people realize that this is the case, and how that then maybe leads to there being sometimes a mismatch between surveys or the survey experiments and the real world outcomes, right? So if you think of like Mato's work on carbon taxation, where we kind of know kind of from the kind of empirical kind of survey experiment literature that rebates work in terms of boosting support. But in the real world, they're just not really communicated very effectively. So you actually don't see them actually practically moving the needle, right? And I think like the Swiss example is perfect of this, where it's like this line item in your health insurance that I lived in Switzerland for 4.5 years and I was fairly aware of as well. And I do climate stuff, right? And so I think it tells you about what the survey shows, tells you if it's communicated in this way, what could happen. But very often people aren't actually communicating in this way. And so I think that's where the kind of interesting mismatch or the kind of variation between the experiment and what we see in terms of actual policy support and public acceptance writ large is really where the action is. And yeah, and so to go on this justification, I think, yeah, that strikes me as a way that again is like a different logic that I haven't really explored. Well, I'll get to my response to Tom's questions where I can explore this a little bit. But I think what you're saying is that the justification of policy matters as much as this is what the outcome of policy is, right? So, and I think that really makes sense from thinking about it, not just in purely like this is a very consequentialist way of thinking of policy, right? In terms of this is your payoff. But if you can feed in these broader deontological kind of ways of justifying it, then that might compound and kind of increase the effectiveness of treatment. And I think that'd be definitely an interesting thing to explore. So with regards to the context, both in terms of the budget constraint and then the reward. So interestingly, from the budgetary perspective, because of the way the payoff structure actually was finalized, the actual like outlay for the universal versus the targeted here was broadly similar in terms of cost. So I think I actually deleted this slide on the train, unfortunately, where like the average cost or the average benefit from the policy was a bit more for the universal, but not like disproportionate, right? And this is partly because of the way the kind of payoff structure is kind of oriented. So at least in terms of the comparison between the two, it's relatively fixed. But I think what's interesting and needs to be explored more is this kind of take one step back. Like, do we decide the size of the budget and then how it's redistributed? Or do we decide, okay, we want to do this and then finance it? Like which is coming first? And I think this is an interesting dynamic. And again, related to the context of the war and maybe justification. So I actually have a paper that's just accepted that looks at this kind of policy design question in terms of kind of broader energy policy in response to this, and comparing the effect of policy design to framing. And one of the framing things is like security as like the justification for investing in energy. And I mean, I tend to be skeptical of framing effects, but you do see like a little framing effect for like this national security and energy independence type logic. But it really pales in comparison to these broader design features in terms of who's getting targeted, where is the money coming from, these kind of things. So it strikes me that it's still like the nuts and bolts of policy is how people primarily engage with this. And of course, framing can like accentuate this a little bit or not, but it isn't like the first thing that makes a lot of the movement.
Hi, I'm Jacob. Thanks for the support raising. So I have two questions. My first question relates to this framing of fairness versus material consideration and whether the distributional treatment is really suitable for this. It seems to me it's pretty much more about heat problem than social problem. And I don't really see you also engaging when you discuss the results with this literature site, because there the discussion is about fairness, fairness effects being heterogeneous across the income. But it seems to me you essentially have parallel shifts into the really heterogeneity in slope. So I mean that would also be a good argument for sort of discarding that kind of range and moving to the other. My other question is about sort of how you would think of follow-up work in a specific sense. So here the target transfer is obviously targeting on income, but of course in climate policy we also often have these horizontal inequalities within income sites. And then targeting might be much more relevant on place of residence, on the home you live in, and so on. And I wonder what the reference expectations are, how the relative preferences changes, and sort of the vector upon which we target becomes high-dimensional.
Jonathan Shaler, I'm CSOC Research Associate. Yeah. I just wondered if we could look at another comparable policy of evolution, which is the ongoing argument about the winter fuel allowance in this country, which was essentially the policy change was driven by issues of fiscal sustainability, as we know, and was done in a hurry, had to, and so therefore administratively they chose an easy cutoff using another existing targeted benefit. And one of the slightly weird things there, it could be interesting perhaps to do a comparable exercise. I wonder how far this sort of exercise is transferable on that particular policy evolution, because slightly weirdly, the top deciles are frankly unchanged. You've got quite a concentrated loss of benefit, disbenefit, if you like, because of the chosen level of cutoff. You also had a slightly strange side effect, which is that quite a lot of charities, small charities particularly, used the winter fuel allowance in practice as a source of income, given the tendency of the people who didn't really need an extra 300 quid or 600 quid or whatever, to give it away because they felt slightly guilty or into the sort of inequality distributional information side.
Any other comments? I would just throw so I think this is excellent stuff. I think that it's gets at the heart of sort of like many things. But I wonder to what extent it's too much to chew. And to what extent you really need the cut that you've given. So I to some extent this could be a simpler story of how making people think about the implications to other social classes, social groups in society will affect the way people think about very tangible, material, household-based policies. Which I think in itself is an intrinsically important thing that we need to bring home, right? Like a lot of this stuff, when it comes to this type of policies, is very centered on individual, cost-benefit analysis. And it is important to remind people what the implications are for communities. And I think that in itself is actually a very interesting result that almost gets washed away from the interactions with the income decile. And as others have said, that interaction actually doesn't always work quite. Doesn't make your paper sing like it could sing. That said, I think Max and others have pointed to this, like, I do want to know more about essentially what is in the heads of people when they get to the distributional treatment. Because it's not completely clear to me. To some extent, I do think they're responding with slightly social desirability bias, type of flavor of responses. So I want to know if you are able somehow to disentangle that. Also, one thing that was a so it's essentially 2 experiments in one. Do people that get to the distributional treatment in the first leg potentially get the individual only leg? So like, do they get completely randomized afterwards, or
They're assigned.
so they continue on the same? Because I think that makes a lot of sense, and he cleans, of confounders, but again, I'm sort of wondering to what extent then you cut them into thinking about this in such a way that whatever you're picking up in terms of change and update is still very streamlined by the original frame. Just as a side note, I would have loved to see basically the effects without the interaction. Like, I just want to know what is the average. Okay, so you get whatever the last 10 minutes to comment if you, or you just.
Yeah, I mean, I think a bunch of these comments reflect kind of what I see as the next step, which is a bit more the dirty work of trying to break apart the result in terms of subgroup analysis. Particularly, again, because, right, so I'm focusing on this one dimension, but as noted, there's a lot of heterogeneity within these deciles as well, right? Particularly if we think of things relating to how much people may have been affected in general due to, say, the types of dwelling they live in, right? and these kind of aspects. And so there's some items I have in terms of like energy usage and energy sources that people rely on, which maybe can tap into a little bit of this thing of like, okay, are we comparing like apples to oranges, or like if we're looking at those within a decile, and going more into this idea of like, is there like some significant heterogeneity within the deciles that we can actually think about, theorize and understanding better with this particular design? And I think that very much relates, right, to the kind of winter fuel payment, in terms of, right, that this is something that is kind of decoupled in some ways from material need, although it's been sold in that way originally. And a lot of the justification as to why it was then kind of scaled back is to make it more targeted in this way. And so I think, yeah, trying to think through if how the targeting relates to the kind of universality, although that's kind of universal within the group of people, which is a slightly different dynamic. And yeah, these different vectors, as Jakob mentioned, in terms of how you can target and who is eligible versus not, I think is, again, one of these questions that's really interesting to bring up, just because also I know from kind of other work I've done in kind of very distinct other areas, this then tends to bring some other kind of questions of like fairness and deservingness in particular. If you think of like exemptions, so I know there's more from like vehicle usage policy in the global south, that exemptions for women for kind of road restrictions had kind of these kind of political backlash effects because it was considered not related to the target of reducing air pollution, but rather broader gender safety, which then kind of generated this new cleavage amongst policy support. Again, but I feel I'm now complicating the number of factors. It's always a bit of a bad habit, but so yeah, how to try and do that while still being precise and clean is yeah, the bit I'm grappling with, but it's always interesting to think of.
Thanks so much for the very thorough presentation. Thank you all for coming.